It was a cold, damp evening when the first child disappeared. The kind of evening that pulls the sun behind thick layers of clouds and wraps the earth in an eerie silence. The river, which slithered through the town like a black ribbon, gleamed ominously in the dim light. Its waters were still, unnervingly so, reflecting the trees that lined its banks with the unnatural clarity of a glass mirror. A murmur ran through the villagers, like the quiet flutter of wings against the dark. They all knew it. The river had a way of drawing people in, but no one spoke it aloud. Not anymore. Not after what happened that year. The whispers began shortly after young Thomas was seen near the river's edge. His mother had sent him to fetch firewood for the evening. Thomas was a quiet boy, small for his age, with bright eyes that seemed too large for his face. His parents often said he had a way of getting lost in his own thoughts. Perhaps it was that tendency, that dreaminess, that had led him to the river on that fateful evening. But when his mother called for him, and he did not answer, the town grew anxious. It wasn't like Thomas to stray far. And the river, with its dark currents and whispered legends, was never a place to linger. Hours passed before a search party was organized. The men of the village, lanterns flickering in their hands, combed the forest, calling his name, shouting until their throats grew raw. But Thomas was nowhere to be found. The river, with its still, mirror-like surface, betrayed no sign of disturbance. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had ever stepped into its water. Only the whispering trees and the occasional ripple that seemed to form out of nothing, then fade as quickly as it came. It was the following morning when the first of the peculiar things occurred. Thomas's mother, distraught and pacing near the river, swore she heard a child's laughter, a soft, melodic sound that chilled her to the bone. She turned, expecting to see Thomas, but there was nothing. Nothing except the river, dark and silent, its surface untouched. And then it came again. A fleeting sound, so faint it could have been the wind. But it was unmistakable. The laughter of a child. Thomas's mother's heart stopped. She knew then that something was terribly wrong. The days that followed were marked by an uneasy tension. The village, which had once been bustling with the sound of children's laughter and the smell of hearth fires, now seemed quieter, as if the river had stolen the life from it. Children stopped playing near the banks, and the older folk began to speak more of the river's old legends. Stories of a witch who once lived by the water, a woman whose beauty was as strange as the river itself. They spoke of how she had been betrayed by a lover and cast into the river, never to be seen again. But her spirit, they said, lingered in the dark waters, waiting for those who wandered too close. The whispers grew louder as Thomas's disappearance remained unsolved. Some called it coincidence, others superstition. But no one could deny the change in the air, the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The river was no longer a peaceful stream, but a thing of menace, its depths now dark and unknowable. And it wasn't just Thomas who was lost. As weeks passed, 2 more children disappeared, vanishing without a trace, their families left in despair and confusion. The search parties became more frequent, but each attempt to find the missing children was met with the same result. Nothing. Not a single trace. The river, the very heart of the town, seemed to consume them whole. It was then that old Mirabelle, the village's healer, who had lived longer than anyone could remember, finally spoke up. She told them, in a voice as cracked as the dry earth, of a legend long forgotten. "The river is not just water," she said. "It is a curse. The witch, she waits for the children." Her words hung in the air, heavy with something ancient and unspoken. She steals them from their families, draws them into the water where they disappear, never to be found again. Mirabelle's eyes, old and clouded with age, bore into the villagers as she spoke. They say she only comes for those who are pure of heart, those who can hear her call. She is the voice in the wind, the whisper beneath the trees. She is the river, and the river is her. The villagers, fearful yet skeptical, gathered that night, sitting in the dim light of the tavern as Mirabelle told them more of the river witch. She spoke of how the witch had once been a woman of great beauty, beloved by all who met her. But that was before the curse. Betrayed by a lover who sought to take her life, the witch was cast into the river, her beauty forever lost in the depths. But as time passed, she had come to embody the river itself, her spirit bound to its dark waters. Her voice could be heard in the rustle of the leaves, in the soft trickle of water as it touched the rocks. The villagers listened in silence, some in disbelief, others in horror. But in the pit of their stomachs, they all knew it. Something had changed. The river had always been there, a constant, a familiar part of their lives. But now, it felt different. It felt alive, and it was calling to them. On the 7th day after Thomas's disappearance, the town gathered at the river's edge. They stood in silence, the air thick with unspoken fear. No one dared speak as the dark water lapped against the shore, as if beckoning them closer. And then the laughter came again, soft, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but unmistakable. The villagers turned to one another, their faces pale with fear. It was Thomas's laughter. Or was it? The laughter seemed to grow louder, closer. And in that moment, the unspoken truth settled in the hearts of all present. The river was calling them. Not just for Thomas, but for all of them. It was not just a curse. It was a warning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the villagers retreated to their homes, leaving the river behind. But the sound of the laughter lingered in their ears, like a distant melody that refused to fade. No one spoke of the river after that night. The children stayed away, their parents keeping them inside as the darkness fell. But still, the river whispered. Still, the witch waited, and the town, once full of life, now stood on the edge of something far older, far darker than anyone could have imagined. The river had always been a part of their lives, but now it had become something else entirely. It had become a warning, a promise, a curse. The witch was watching, waiting for the next child to hear her call. And when they did, the river would have them, forever. The town, once vibrant with the sounds of children playing and the hustle of daily life, now stood in suffocating silence. It had been weeks since Thomas had vanished, and still no trace of him could be found. The river, ever silent and still, hid its secrets beneath its glassy surface. People no longer walked along its banks, and the laughter of children had long since ceased. The absence of those innocent voices was a quiet reminder of the horror that now gripped the village. The disappearances did not stop with Thomas. Soon, 2 more children, Hannah, a spirited girl with curly blonde hair, and little Peter, a boy with wide, innocent eyes, disappeared in the same unsettling manner. The town was shaken to its core. 3 children, all gone without a trace, each one lost to the river as though it had swallowed them whole. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, only the quiet ripple of water under the fading moonlight. The river was as still as ever, but in the dead of night, the voices of the lost seemed to grow louder. The whispers, faint at first, now echoed through the trees, twisting through the air like the remnants of forgotten dreams. The families of the missing children were beside themselves, their grief palpable in every corner of the village. Mrs. Kendall, Hannah's mother, wandered the streets in a daze, calling her daughter's name into the wind, her voice cracking with desperation. The townsfolk avoided her gaze, their hearts heavy with the unspeakable truth they were all trying to deny. But there was no denying it now. The river had taken another child, and it had taken them without mercy. In the weeks that followed, the town's mood grew darker. The once joyful chatter that filled the market square had been replaced by murmurs of fear and suspicion. It was a palpable presence, hanging thick in the air like the scent of rain before a storm. The disappearance of the children was no longer a matter of when they would be found, but if they would ever return. Some whispered that it was the work of the river witch, the creature of legend that Mirabel had spoken of. But there were others, those who clung to their rationality, who dismissed it as superstition. Still, a growing number of villagers began to wonder if there was some truth to the old tales. No one dared speak of it aloud, but in the quietest hours of the night, when the wind howled and the trees creaked under the weight of their age, the villagers would share their fears in hushed voices. The witch had returned, they said, and with her, the river had awakened. A council was held in the town's only inn, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows against the walls as the villagers gathered to discuss the disappearances. The air was thick with fear, the weight of it pressing down on every soul in the room. No one had answers, and yet everyone had questions. Was it the witch? Was it something else? And why, after all these years, had the river suddenly become so active? The questions swirled in the air, unanswered, leaving an uneasy tension in their wake. It was during this meeting that a new idea surfaced, one that would change everything. A group of brave men, led by the blacksmith, James Turner, volunteered to venture into the forest and confront whatever malevolent force was lurking by the river. They would find the children, they would find Thomas, Hannah, and Peter. No one would be left behind. With resolve in their hearts, the group set out the very next morning. They walked through the dense woods, their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. The forest was eerily silent, as though it too was holding its breath. The trees stood like sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out to touch the sky. The river, in the distance, gurgled softly, as if beckoning them closer. The men had been walking for hours, the path growing narrower and more treacherous as they ventured deeper into the heart of the forest. The air grew thick with fog, and the scent of damp earth filled their lungs. Every rustle in the undergrowth made them startle, their eyes darting nervously at each new sound. The forest felt alive, watching them, waiting. It wasn't until they reached the river's edge that the first sign of something truly sinister appeared. James Turner, ever the skeptic, was the first to spot it. There, lying on the ground, half hidden by the overgrown grass, was a small wooden toy. One of the very toys that Thomas had been known to play with. His heart dropped into his stomach as he bent down to pick it up. The toy, a carved wooden horse, was worn with age, but there was no mistaking it. It was Thomas's. The men exchanged nervous glances, the weight of the discovery sinking in. The river had taken him. And it wasn't just Thomas. Hannah and Peter had been here too. The realization was a cold slap to the face. They were too late. The children were lost. But something deeper stirred within the men. It wasn't just fear. It was a deep, instinctual terror. They could feel it now, in the air, in the very ground beneath their feet. The river was watching them. It was alive with something ancient and unfathomable. And it wasn't going to let them leave. They stood there in silence for what seemed like an eternity, the sound of rushing water growing louder, more insistent. Then, from the corner of his eye, James thought he saw a shadow move across the water's surface. It was swift, like a ripple, but it didn't belong there. It wasn't natural. He blinked, and it was gone. But the terror it left in its wake remained. The group was growing nervous now, their resolve faltering. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was following them, just out of sight. But there was no turning back now. They had come this far, and they were determined to find the children, even if it meant facing whatever horror awaited them. They ventured further along the river's edge, each step heavier than the last. And then, as if on cue, the laughter came. It was faint at first, barely audible above the rush of the river. But as they listened, it grew louder. A child's laughter, high-pitched and innocent, yet filled with an unnerving echo. It sent a chill down their spines, and they froze. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, beneath the water, from the trees, from the very earth itself. It was as though the children were laughing, not from joy, but from something far darker. James felt his breath catch in his throat. "It's them," he whispered, barely able to believe the words. "The children. They're here." But as he turned to call out to the others, the laughter stopped. The forest went deathly still. And in that silence, they heard something else. A voice, a soft, feminine voice, drifting across the river like a whisper carried by the wind. It was so faint, so distant, yet it sent a shiver down their spines. It was a voice that spoke not in words, but in a language older than time itself, a language of the river, a language of the witch. The men stood frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests. The voice faded, but the river's murmur lingered, filling their ears with its ancient, endless call. There would be no more searching. There would be no escape. The river had claimed them all. The town was no longer the place it once was. The warmth that had once enveloped the streets was now gone, replaced by a chill that cut through the bones. The disappearance of the children had cast a long shadow over the village. The laughter that used to fill the air had faded into hushed whispers. Even the sun seemed to refuse to shine as brightly as before, and the river, always present, always there, had become an inescapable force. The river had taken them, Thomas, Hannah, Peter, and who knew how many more in the past. But it was not only the river that held the town captive now. It was something older, something far more sinister. The voice, soft and distant, had haunted James Turner's dreams ever since that fateful day at the river. He could hear it clearly now in the darkness of his mind, whispering things he could not understand, yet felt in his very soul. And as he lay in his bed, drenched in sweat, a realization began to creep up his spine like the cold fingers of death itself. The voice was not a mere figment of his imagination. It was the river witch. She was real, and she had returned. He had heard the stories, of course, tales passed down through the generations, whispered around campfires or in hushed tones at the inn. The legend of the river witch was old, older than the town itself, and older than the river that snaked through it like a dark artery. It was said that the witch had once been a beautiful woman, her skin as pale as the moon, her hair as black as night. She had lived by the river long ago, a woman both revered and feared by the villagers. Her beauty had been unmatched, But it had come at a cost. For she had known things, secrets that no one should have known. And when she fell in love with a man who could not love her in return, her heart turned as black as the waters that surrounded her. Her love became her obsession, and her obsession became her undoing. Betrayed and heartbroken, she had cast herself into the river in despair. But the water, instead of taking her life, had bound her to it. Her spirit had become part of the river itself, and it was said that she now roamed its depths, calling to the innocent, stealing them away, and dragging them into the darkness where they could never be found. James had dismissed the story, of course. Who wouldn't? It was a tale of old wives and superstition. But as he stood there, staring out over the river, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees felt different. It wasn't the soft murmur of nature. It was something more deliberate, something more alive. The river was no longer just a part of the landscape. It was watching, and it was waiting. He had to know more. The following day, he sought out Mirabelle, the village healer. She was old, frail, but her mind was sharp as ever. The years had not dulled her senses, nor had the passage of time diminished the gravity of her words. She'd seen it all, life, death, and everything in between. If anyone knew the truth about the witch, it would be her. Mirabelle sat in her small cottage, the walls cluttered with bottles of herbs, old books, and strange talismans that seemed to hum with an energy of their own. She looked up from her work as James entered, her eyes narrowing, as though she had been expecting him. "You've felt it, haven't you?" she said, her voice soft, but edged with something ancient. "The river. It calls to you." James swallowed, his throat dry. "It's real, isn't it? The river witch. She's real." Mirabelle nodded slowly. "Oh, yes. She's very real. But you must understand, James, she's not just some spirit haunting the waters. No. She is the river, and the river is her. She was born of it, and when she died, the river claimed her. Her soul is bound to its depths, and she draws those who are pure of heart into its cold embrace." James felt a chill creep up his spine. But why? Why the children? Mirabelle sighed deeply, as if the weight of the question had been asked too many times before. "The witch is not a monster, not in the way you might think. She was once a woman who loved and lost. But her grief, her pain, it twisted her. Over time, the river became a prison for her, and she began to reach out, to take those who wandered too close, to feel that love she had lost." She paused, her gaze distant. Children are innocent, pure. They have something she craves, something she can never have again. James's heart hammered in his chest. So she takes them. But why? What does she do with them? "She keeps them," Mirabelle said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She keeps them in the river, beneath the water where no one can find them. She wants them to be with her, to be part of the river like she is. They become part of her world, trapped in the depths, forever. And when she has enough, when she's fed, she leaves them, sends them back, or at least what remains of them. But they are never the same." The words hung in the air like a curse. James had heard rumors, of course. Whispers of children who returned, changed, haunted by something that could not be named. But no one had ever spoken of the witch with such conviction. It was as though Mirabelle had seen it with her own eyes, felt it deep in her bones. And now, the truth was clear. The river witch had claimed the children. Thomas, Hannah, Peter, they were lost to her forever. James left Mirabelle's cottage that afternoon with a heavy heart. The sky had turned a pale gray, the clouds hanging low, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. The wind had picked up, swirling through the trees, and for the first time in his life, James felt the weight of something truly ancient bearing down upon him. That night, as the villagers gathered in the inn, James stood at the edge of the firelight, watching them talk. They were speaking in hushed tones, afraid to say too much aloud. They knew the truth, deep down. They knew the river had taken the children, and that the witch was not a mere ghost. She was real, and she was still there, waiting, watching. But there was something else in the air, something more than just fear. There was a sense of inevitability. The river had claimed its prize, and now it was watching the town, waiting for the next victim. And then, in the middle of the night, the laughter returned. It was faint at first, just a whisper on the wind. But it grew louder, clearer, until it was unmistakable. It was a child's laughter, high-pitched and innocent, but tinged with something dark, something wrong. The townspeople froze, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. The witch was calling again. The river had come for them all. The town could no longer ignore the creeping dread that had settled like a heavy fog in their hearts. The Swama children were lost, and with them, a part of the town's spirit had vanished. The once bright faces of the villagers had dimmed, their eyes clouded with sorrow, fear, and a helpless sense of doom. Even those who had once laughed in the streets, their voices ringing clear like bells on a summer day, now spoke in whispers. Their steps hurried, their gazes constantly darting toward the river. The laughter of the children, though faint at first, had grown stronger over the weeks. It no longer came only on the wind, but seemed to echo from deep within the forest itself. There were nights when the trees would shiver, their branches creaking as though the weight of something ancient pressed down upon them. The village became a place of shadows, and the moonlight seemed to grow colder, casting eerie shapes across the land. It was as if the very earth itself had been touched by the witch's power, and with it, the land had begun to change. The once thriving forest, which had always been a place of solace for the villagers, now felt like a labyrinth of creeping despair. Every path seemed to lead deeper into the darkness, and every rustling of leaves felt like a warning, a message from the witch herself. The trees, their gnarled branches twisting toward the sky, seemed to reach out like hands, grasping for something, for someone. And as the villagers ventured deeper into the woods, they could not shake the feeling that something was following them, something that was not of this world. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into a shadowy twilight, a group of villagers gathered at the edge of the forest. Among them was James Turner, his face pale and drawn with the weight of the knowledge he had gained. Mirabelle's words echoed in his mind. The river is alive. It is the witch, and the witch is the river. There was no escaping it. The town was bound to the river as surely as the river was bound to the witch. The group stood at the tree line, staring into the darkening forest. Their lanterns flickered feebly in the growing gloom, casting long, wavering shadows on the ground. They had gathered to search for signs of the children, to follow the trail of whispers, of laughter, and of stolen innocence. But James could see it in their eyes. They were not searching for the children anymore. They were searching for something more, something darker, a truth they could no longer avoid. "We must find where they went," James said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might bring the witch's attention down upon them. "We must find the witch." One of the older men, a farmer named Peter, spoke up. "And what then? If we find her, What will we do? How do you fight something like this? James stared into the forest, his eyes narrowing. I don't know. But if we don't try, if we don't face it now, there will be no one left to save. The group nodded, the weight of his words settling over them like a shroud. And so, with lanterns raised high and hearts heavy with fear, they stepped into the forest. The air grew thick as they moved further from the village, the trees closing in around them like silent sentinels. The path was rough, overgrown with roots and vines that seemed to shift beneath their feet. The wind had stopped, leaving behind an unnatural stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. As they walked, James could feel the eyes of the forest upon them, the eyes of something ancient and restless. It was as if the very ground they walked on had been touched by the witch's curse. And now it too was watching, waiting. Every shadow seemed to twitch with movement, and every gust of wind carried with it the faint sound of whispers, soft, unintelligible, like voices that had been drowned by time itself. The laughter came again, faint at first, but slowly growing louder, as though the children themselves were walking alongside them. It was high-pitched, joyous, but tinged with an undertone of something darker. The sound seemed to echo from the trees themselves, the laughter of those long lost. And in the back of James's mind, a question began to form. Were they really lost? Or had they become part of the witch's world, part of the river, part of something else entirely? The group pressed on, the laughter growing louder with each step, until it seemed to surround them completely. It was everywhere, in the wind, in the trees, in the very air they breathed. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. In that silence, the forest seemed to breathe. The trees groaned as though shifting in the presence of something old, something powerful. A chill swept through the air, and James felt his heart race. He glanced around, his eyes searching for something, anything. But there was nothing, only the dense shadows of the forest and the distant murmur of the river, its waters flowing endlessly toward the unknown. Then the voice came. It was soft at first, a mere whisper on the wind, but as it drew closer, it became clearer. It was the voice of a woman, calm and soothing, but laced with something strange, something unsettling. It spoke the name of a child, but James could not make out the words. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling in the stillness. The voice did not answer. Instead, the sound of footsteps echoed through the forest, slow and deliberate, like someone, or something, was approaching. The ground beneath James's feet seemed to tremble, and the air grew heavier, suffocating. He turned to look at the others, but they were no longer there. They had vanished, lost in the darkness. The voice came again, closer this time, and James felt a cold hand brush against the back of his neck. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the trees, their twisted limbs reaching for the sky, their bark cracked and weathered by time. And then, through the darkness, he saw her. She was standing at the edge of the river, her figure a shadow against the moonlight. Her face was obscured, but James could feel her eyes on him. Her presence was like a weight in the air, a suffocating force that pressed down on him. He could hear her breathing, slow and steady, as though she were waiting for him to make the next move. The witch. She was real. And she was waiting. James opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure before him. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished, slipping into the shadows like a wisp of smoke. The air grew still once more, the forest silent again, save for the faint whisper of the river. James stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest, his eyes straining to see through the darkness. He had seen her. The river witch. She was real. And now she knew he was here. And then, with a final, lingering whisper, the voice spoke again. Come closer. The village, once so full of life, was now a place steeped in dread, as if it were slowly being consumed by the river itself. The once bustling market square stood quiet. The merchants who had once called out their wares now absent, their stalls abandoned. The people still walked the streets, but they did so with their heads down, eyes averted, as if they feared the very sight of the river. Every step taken, every glance cast toward the flowing water, carried with it a sense of inevitability, an unspoken truth that the river had claimed the town. And it was not done. It was on the 6th night after James Turner had encountered the witch, standing there at the edge of the river, that the village gathered once more. This time, they gathered not just out of fear or curiosity, but out of necessity. Something had to be done. They could not simply sit and wait for the river to take more of them, to claim their children, their homes, their very futures. There had to be a way to stop it. There had to be a way to end the witch's reign of terror. The inn was crowded that night. The flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls as the villagers spoke in hushed tones. There was no longer a sense of hope in their voices. They had all heard the same whispers. The witch was real, and she had already taken more than they could bear. Now she was coming for them all. The fear that had once been a distant tremor now gripped them tightly, like a hand around their throats. James sat at the far end of the room, his face pale, his eyes distant. He could still hear the witch's voice in his mind, a whisper in the darkness, soft and laced with power. It haunted him, even in the safety of the crowded inn. The others were speaking of solutions, of ways to fight back. But James had already realized the truth. The river was not something they could fight. It was something they could only bargain with. It was Mirabelle who spoke first, her voice soft but clear. She had been quiet for most of the evening, but now, as the murmurs of the villagers grew louder, she stood, her eyes, old and clouded with age, fixed on James. The only way to stop the witch, she said, is to understand her. And to understand her, you must understand the river. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Mirabelle's reputation as a healer and wise woman had kept her at the edge of the village's society. But her knowledge was not to be questioned. She had lived longer than any of them, and in her old bones, she carried the weight of forgotten secrets. The river, she continued, her voice steady, is not just a body of water. It is a living thing, as much a part of this land as the trees or the rocks. It was here long before we came, and it will be here long after we are gone. The witch, she is a part of it. And the only way to stop her is to make peace with the river. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of disbelief and fear. How could they make peace with something so unnatural, so full of death? Mirabelle's gaze grew more intense, her eyes narrowing. We must offer the river something in return, something it desires. Only then will it release the witch and her hold on us. James stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You're talking about a deal, a pact. You want us to bargain with the river witch. His voice was raw, laced with frustration and fear. How can we bargain with something like that? What could we possibly offer her? Mirabel met his gaze without flinching. I've seen it before, James. I've seen towns lost to the river, and I've seen them make the pact. It is not a simple bargain. It's a dangerous one. But if we do nothing, we will all be lost. The room fell into an uneasy silence. The flicker of candlelight was the only sound, casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. James looked around at the faces of the villagers, faces filled with fear, confusion, and desperation. He could see it in their eyes. They were willing to do anything now, anything to end the nightmare. "What do we have to offer?" James asked, his voice trembling. "What is the price?" Mirabel's eyes softened. The river does not care for gold or riches. It does not care for possessions. What the river wants is life, the life of someone pure, someone untouched by the darkness, a child. James's heart stopped. The air seemed to freeze, as though the very breath had been sucked out of the room. "You want us to sacrifice a child?" Mirabel nodded, the sorrow in her eyes clear. "The river demands balance. A life taken, a life returned. The witch is part of the river's balance. She has claimed the lives of the children, and now the river demands that one of our own is given to replace them. Only then will it release her hold on the town." The room erupted into chaos. Voices rose in protest, in disbelief. Some wept openly, others shouted in anger. But none of them could escape the truth of Mirabel's words. The river demanded a price, and it would not be satisfied until it had one. James's mind spun. He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him, a crushing weight that threatened to swallow him whole. There was no escaping it. The river, the witch, the pact. It was all connected. They were at the mercy of something older, something beyond their understanding. And yet, there was a part of him that understood. He had seen it in the eyes of the witch, her hunger, her longing. She wasn't a monster, not in the way they thought. She was bound to the river, a prisoner to its endless flow, and the river had taken what it wanted, just as it had always done. The pact was the only way to stop it. But the cost was something no one could bear. "Who?" James asked, his voice hoarse. "Who will we give?" Mirabel didn't answer immediately. She stared at James, her eyes filled with something ancient, something he couldn't quite understand. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "The child must be one of us. A child who is not yet tainted by the dark. One who can return what was taken." The room was silent. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. And in that silence, the river outside seemed to whisper, its waters lapping gently against the shore, as though it too was waiting for an answer. James turned away, his heart heavy with the enormity of the choice. There was no easy way out. The pact had to be made, or the witch would remain. The river would claim more of them, and the town would wither, its soul lost forever. And so, the decision was made. The village would offer the river what it demanded. The witch would be released, and the town would be free. But it would come at a terrible price. A life would be given to the river. One life in exchange for the others. The night that followed was one of quiet desperation. The villagers gathered by the river, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. The water, still and dark, seemed to pulse with life, as though the river itself knew that its price would soon be paid. And as the villagers prepared to make the offering, the wind began to howl, and the river's whisper grew louder, until it seemed to surround them, a haunting reminder of the power they had bargained with. But it was too late to turn back now. The pact had been sealed. The whispers of the river had grown silent in the wake of their decision. But the heaviness that hung in the air was undeniable. The villagers, their faces pale with the burden of their choice, stood at the edge of the water, the dark river reflecting the cold light of the moon. It was as if the very earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final moment to pass. No one spoke. The silence was profound, a silence that pressed against their ears and hearts, making each breath feel like a weight too heavy to bear. The child had been chosen. It had to be one of them, one of the purest, untouched by the darkness that had claimed the others. The choice had been made, though it came with deep sorrow. A child of innocence, untouched by the tragedies that had befallen their village. It was Clara, the youngest daughter of the blacksmith, who had been chosen. She was a bright-eyed child, barely 6 years old, with a smile that could light up even the darkest of days. Her laughter was a sound so pure that it had once echoed like music through the village. Her innocence was untouched by the world's cruelty, and it was this purity that the river craved. Clara had been chosen to restore balance, to offer herself in exchange for the others. But Clara was not alone in her fate. Her parents, James Turner, and every other villager stood together in the shadow of their collective choice. They had promised the river what it wanted, but now the weight of that promise was unbearable. The witch's influence was a lingering presence, lingering on the edge of their consciousness, waiting for the final offering to be made. The village gathered near the river's edge, a crowd of silent figures standing together, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that this moment could not be undone. Clara's parents, pale and trembling, held their daughter close. She had no understanding of the sacrifice she was to make, her innocent gaze lost in the wonder of the world around her. But her parents did. They held her tight, their love for her evident in the way their arms trembled, as though they could keep her safe from the river's call. "Is it truly necessary?" one villager asked in a trembling voice, though no one dared answer. The witch's presence seemed to grow with every passing moment. Her whispers, soft, enticing, seductive, could be heard on the wind, as though she were waiting for them to make the final step. The witch, bound to the river, had waited centuries for this moment. And now it was here. The river swelled, as if responding to their fear, its waters rolling with a dark energy that felt alive. The trees along the bank seemed to bend toward the water, their branches reaching as if to grasp the villagers, as though they too were part of the witch's world. And then, as the full moon rose high above the river, the air shifted. A sudden cold swept over the crowd, and the surface of the river rippled, as if something beneath the water stirred in anticipation. Clara's mother, her face streaked with tears, kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "Forgive us, my darling. We did not know how to save you, but we love you." The child looked up at her mother with wide, trusting eyes, completely unaware of the depths of the sacrifice she was about to make. Clara's innocence was a painful reminder of the cruelty of the pact. She had done nothing to deserve this fate. But the river had spoken, and there was no turning back. The villagers stood together, their breath coming in shallow gasps. They could hear the whisper of the witch, carried on the wind. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the witch emerged from the water. She was not as the legends had described her. She was not the twisted figure that the townspeople had feared. No, she was beautiful. Her face was pale, almost glowing in the moonlight, her long hair flowing like dark tendrils of water. She stood at the edge of the river, her gaze fixed upon Clara, who gazed back with innocent curiosity. The witch's eyes glimmered with a strange hunger, but it was not one of malice. It was something older, something that only the river could understand. The witch's voice, low and musical, drifted through the stillness of the night. "You have come to bargain," she said, her words carrying with them the weight of ancient sorrow. "You have given what I asked. The child is pure. She is mine now." Clara's parents stepped forward, their faces twisted with grief and love. "Take her, then," the blacksmith said, his voice breaking. "Take her, and let us have our children back." The witch looked at him, her eyes cold yet strangely empathetic. "You gave her to me, not for your children, but for yourselves. The river demands balance, and it is you who will pay the price, not just her." The air grew heavier, the weight of her words sinking into the villagers' hearts like a stone. The bargain was not yet finished. The witch's gaze shifted to the water, and the surface began to swirl, as if a force far stronger than the current was at work beneath the dark depths. The river seemed to groan, its waters rising in an eerie crescendo, a deep and unsettling sound that vibrated through the villagers' bones. "The river has taken what it was owed," the witch continued. "But there is always a cost. The price of this pact does not end with one life. You have given me a child, but the river's thirst will not be quenched by that alone." The villagers stood frozen, dread spreading through them like a plague. A low murmur of fear rippled through the crowd. They had known the price, but none had understood its true cost. The witch's hunger was never satisfied, not by one life, not even by 10. There was always a price to pay. And now, they were learning it. The witch's smile curled, the faintest trace of satisfaction in her eyes. "The price you will pay is your town's soul. Each of you must choose. Give me your memories, or your loved ones will return to me, bound to the river forever. You will be free of your children, but you will forget them. Or you may remember them, and I will take you into the depths with them." A gasp ran through the crowd. The villagers had thought they could end the witch's reign with a single offering. But the river had twisted the terms, turned them into something darker, something more cruel. And they had no choice but to comply. The witch's voice was a lullaby, soft and terrible. "You have made your choice." And with that, the river's surface cracked open. The villagers, gripped by the horror of the pact, felt their hearts tighten in terror. Some stepped forward, whispering a silent prayer, willing to forget. Others clung to their memories, refusing to give up what little they had left. But the river did not wait. It was pulling them, drawing them in. And as the witch's gaze turned toward Clara, the final echo of the forgotten town began to fade into the water. The moon hung heavy in the sky, its pale light reflecting off the surface of the river, now a silent, brooding mass of water. The witch had come and gone, her presence lingering like a dark stain on the land. The pact had been made. Clara, the youngest and purest of the village's children, had been given to the river, an offering to the witch in exchange for the balance that had been sought for so long. But as the villagers stood there, their hearts torn between sorrow and relief, they could not shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The witch had taken Clara, but the river's demands were far from over. The weight of their bargain hung heavy on their shoulders. They had hoped that by giving her what the river wanted, they could free the town from the horrors it had suffered. But in return, the witch had made it clear that the cost would be far greater than anyone had expected. James Turner stood at the edge of the water, his face pale and drawn. His eyes, once filled with hope, were now clouded with a deep, unspoken grief. Clara's disappearance had left a hole in his heart that no amount of time could fill. He had been the one to lead the charge, the one who had insisted on the pact, and now he could feel the weight of that decision crushing him. The villagers had returned to their homes after the witch's departure, but none of them had slept. They lay in their beds, staring at the ceiling, their minds consumed by what had happened, by what they had done. Some of them could still hear Clara's laughter in their minds, that pure, innocent sound that had once filled the air, but now seemed like a cruel memory, a reminder of what they had lost. James could not stay in his house. The silence there was unbearable. He had to know. He had to understand why the river had taken their children and why the witch had demanded such a terrible price. So, he made his way back to the riverbank, hoping that somehow, some way, the answers he sought would be found in the depths of the water. As he approached the river, a cold wind swept through the trees, and the surface of the water began to ripple. It was subtle at first, just the faintest suggestion of movement beneath the surface. But then, the ripples grew stronger, the water swirling as if something or someone was stirring within it. James stopped, his heart racing in his chest. He could feel the pull of the river, as if it were calling to him, beckoning him closer. The wind howled through the trees, the sound a mournful wail, as if the forest itself was mourning the loss of the children. The whispers were back, faint at first, but then growing louder, swirling around him like the voices of the lost. "Clara." The voice was soft, like a dream. Yet it cut through the air with the force of a knife. It was her voice, her innocent, pure voice, the same one that had once echoed through the village. "Clara." The voice came again, but this time there was something different about it, something dark. James took a step forward, his feet carrying him toward the water, as if they were no longer his own. His breath caught in his throat as the water seemed to respond to his movements, the surface rippling in time with his footsteps. And then he saw her. Clara stood at the edge of the water, her small form illuminated by the moonlight. Her eyes, wide and trusting, were fixed on him, and for a moment he thought she had returned. He reached out a trembling hand, his heart filled with both hope and terror. But then, as his fingers drew closer, Clara's face twisted. Her smile, once bright and full of innocence, was now twisted, warped by something dark, something not of this world. Her once pristine skin was now pale and cold, like marble, and her hair, once golden and shining, now hung in limp strands, dark and lifeless. The light in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. It was as though she were not truly Clara anymore, but something else entirely, a shadow of the child she had been. "Clara," James whispered, his voice trembling with fear and disbelief. The girl's lips parted, but it was not Clara's voice that came out. It was the witch's voice, low and melodic, yet filled with a terrible power. "You gave her to me, James. You gave her to the river. Now she is mine, and you are mine too." The words echoed in James's mind, like a terrible refrain, and he took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The river, the witch, they were all part of a world he had never understood, a world that was now claiming him as well. "No," he gasped, shaking his head as if trying to rid himself of the nightmare that was unfolding before him. "No, this can't be real. Clara, Clara, what have I done?" The figure before him smiled again, but it was not a smile of innocence. It was a cruel, mocking smile that sent a chill down his spine. "You wanted balance?" the witch's voice whispered. "You wanted peace, but there is no peace. Not in the river, not in the witch, and not in you." James stumbled back, his legs weak beneath him. He wanted to turn and run, but something held him in place, something more powerful than fear, something ancient and inescapable. He could feel it now, the weight of the witch's presence pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. The river had claimed Clara, and now it had claimed him as well. "Clara!" he cried out, reaching for the child. But she took a step back, retreating into the water. The water lapped at her feet, swirling around her like a dark embrace. "You will never leave," she whispered, her voice cold and distant. "You are mine now." James reached for her, desperate to save the child he had lost. But the water surged forward, pulling her beneath the surface. His fingers brushed against her hand, but it was cold, lifeless. She was gone. She was no longer the child he had known. The river's grip tightened, pulling him closer to the water's edge. The voices of the lost children filled his ears, their whispers rising in volume, as if they were all around him. They were not gone. They were not lost. They were here, in the river, in the witch, in the darkness that had consumed them all. "Help me," James whispered, his voice breaking as he fell to his knees, the river's pull growing stronger. But there was no answer, only the echo of the children's laughter, faint and distant, as if they were calling from the depths of the river, waiting for him to join them. The witch had won. The pact had been made. And now, the town would pay the price. The last child had been claimed, and the river's hunger would never be satisfied. The moon hung low in the sky, a pale silver orb casting its cold light over the dark, undulating surface of the river. It was an eerie scene, the water flowing gently as though it were a living entity, breathing in the night air, moving with a purpose only it could understand. The whispers, the voices of those lost to the river, still lingered, but now they seemed to be growing distant, fading into the dark corners of the earth. Yet, there was something else in the air, something far more oppressive than the usual presence of the witch. The heart of the river, the very source of its power, was stirring. The villagers had returned to their homes, their faces hollow, their spirits broken. The child had been taken, and with it, the last shred of hope had disappeared. What had once been a close-knit community now stood on the edge of ruin, a place hollowed out by its own fears and its willingness to bargain with the river. Their lives were no longer their own. They had made a pact with something ancient, and now it was time to pay the price. But James Turner could not bring himself to leave. He could not return to his home, to the empty, cold room where his daughter's laughter once echoed. He had seen Clara's twisted, hollowed form at the riverbank, her innocence lost, replaced by something far darker. And now he was alone with his guilt and his grief, staring at the water that had swallowed so much from them. He stood at the river's edge, watching the swirling currents, his heart heavy with sorrow. What had he done? What had they all done? The witch was real, and she was not just a creature of legend, but a force, ancient, powerful, and all-consuming. The river was no mere body of water. It was a living thing, bound to the witch, bound to something older than time itself. It had claimed Clara. It had claimed the town's children. And now it was claiming the very souls of those who had made the pact. James had no answers, no comfort to offer himself. The river had taken everything, and in return, it had given nothing. But as he stood there, staring into the depths, something shifted within the water. A ripple moved through the surface, a subtle disturbance that made his skin crawl. He took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. He could feel it now. Something was coming, something from the heart of the river itself. The very air around him seemed to thicken, as though the atmosphere had become charged with an unnatural energy. And then the river spoke. It was not a voice he heard with his ears, but with his soul, deep within him, as if the river was reaching into the core of his being, pulling at the threads that made him who he was. "James Turner," the river whispered, its voice soft, haunting, and all-encompassing. "You have given. You have sacrificed. But now, you must understand." He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice, though soft, was filled with a power he could not deny. It was not just the witch now, it was the river itself, speaking to him. It had been waiting for him to understand, waiting for him to see what had been there all along. "You are part of me now," the river continued. "The town is part of me. The children are part of me. And so are you." James's legs weakened, and he sank to his knees, his hands trembling at his sides. The weight of the river's words settled over him, suffocating him with their meaning. He had made the pact. He had offered Clara, he had offered the purity of the children, and now the price was being exacted. "Why?" he whispered, his voice raw with anguish. "Why take her? Why take them?" The river responded, its voice filled with a deep, mournful resonance. "I did not take them, James. I gave them what they needed. What you needed. The balance must be restored, and you have taken from me. You wanted to stop the suffering, to end the fear. But you cannot escape the cycle. It will never end." James felt the full weight of the river's words sink in, the truth unfurling in his mind, like the darkness of the deep. The river was not a mere place. It was a force of nature, a living thing, older than the town itself, older than the witch. It had existed long before them, and it would continue long after. The children, the people, the town, they were all part of the river's cycle, woven into its eternal flow. "You are bound to me now," the river whispered, as if it had read his thoughts. "And you will never leave." The water at his feet began to churn, its surface rising, rippling like a living thing. James felt his heart race as the water rose higher, swirling around his legs, pulling him toward the depths. It was as though the river had awakened, as though it had been waiting for this moment, for his understanding, his acceptance. And now it would claim him as it had claimed the others. He struggled, his hands reaching for the shore, but the current was too strong. The water tugged at him, relentless, pulling him deeper into its grasp. The coldness of the river seeped into his bones, and he gasped as the water rose to his chest, then to his neck. It was no longer a simple flow. It was a force, alive with purpose, alive with the will of the river itself. "No," James cried out, his voice strangled with panic. "Please, I understand. I understand now." But the river did not relent. It pulled him deeper, its currents swirling around him like the coils of a serpent. The witch's voice echoed through his mind, her words a haunting lullaby. "You cannot escape, James Turner. You cannot fight the river. You have given yourself to it, and now you belong to it." The water surged over his head, and for a moment everything was darkness. His heart pounded in his chest, his lungs burning as he fought to stay above the surface. But there was no escaping it. The river had taken him, just as it had taken the children. just as it had claimed the town. And now there was no return. James's thoughts faded, his body growing weak as the river's grip tightened around him. The water swallowed him whole, and in that moment, he became part of the river. His name, his face, his life, everything he had been, became lost in its depths, absorbed into the endless flow of time. The river had claimed him, and with him, the last shred of hope the town had ever had. The village stood at the edge of the abyss, its soul teetering between the world of the living and the endless depths of the river that had claimed so much. The town, once vibrant with the laughter of children and the hum of daily life, now echoed with silence. The children who had once run through the streets, their voices like chimes in the wind, were gone, swallowed by the river's dark embrace. Clara, Thomas, Hannah, Peter, all of them lost to the depths of the water. And now, James Turner, the man who had once sought to stop the river's hunger, was one with the very current that had torn their lives apart. The river's voice had grown fainter in the days following James's disappearance, but its presence was still felt in the air. The villagers had no answers, no comfort. They could not even mourn. What were they mourning for? The children? The man who had tried to save them? Or was it the loss of their own innocence, the realization that they had sealed their own fate with the pact they had made? The air had grown colder since James's disappearance, the land seemingly losing its warmth, as though the river had sucked the very life out of the earth itself. It was as if nature itself had withdrawn, turning inward, retreating into a dark corner of the world. The river flowed endlessly, its currents never slowing, its depths never still. It was a presence now, one that could not be ignored, could not be denied. It had become the heart of the land, its pulse the very rhythm of the town. The villagers had long since stopped trying to resist it. And then, there was a change. It was subtle at first, a whisper on the wind, a shift in the air, but over the course of several days, it grew stronger. The river seemed to beckon, pulling the villagers toward it with a force that they could not understand. There was a tension in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks, a sense of something imminent, something inevitable. The witch's influence was still felt, though her presence had faded into the background, as though she were watching from the shadows, waiting. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a figure appeared at the edge of the river. The villagers, who had long since learned to avoid the river's banks, watched from a distance, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow, its features hidden by the darkness. It moved toward the water's edge, its steps silent as it approached the place where the river met the land. The wind seemed to pick up, howling through the trees, and the river's surface began to ripple. The figure stood at the edge of the water, staring into the depths. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that fills the space between breaths. The villagers watched, their hearts racing, as the figure knelt by the water's edge, its hands reaching down into the dark current. And then, the voice came. It was not the witch's voice this time. It was deeper, more resonant, like the voice of the river itself, its tone calm yet filled with a terrible power. It is time. The figure rose slowly, its hands still hovering over the water, as though it were calling to the depths. And in that moment, the river responded. The water began to swirl, moving faster, its currents churning as if something powerful was rising from within. The villagers gasped in horror as the river's surface broke open, and something, someone began to emerge. The figure that had knelt by the water's edge now stepped back, its eyes locked on the rising force within the water. The water continued to churn, and then, from the depths, something surfaced. At first, it was only a shadow, a dark silhouette against the pale moonlight. But as it rose higher, it became clear that it was not a creature, but a person, a child. The child, pale and motionless, was lifted from the water by unseen hands, its body floating above the surface. The villagers stared in shock, unsure whether to run or stay. It was impossible to look away, as though the very air had locked them in place. The child's body was lifeless, its skin pale and cold, but its eyes, those eyes, were wide open, staring into the distance. There was something unnerving in their gaze, something that made the villagers' blood run cold. The child's face was not one they recognized. It was not Thomas, not Clara, not any of the others who had disappeared. This was a new child, someone who had never been seen before, someone who had no place in their world. The river's voice spoke again, its tone heavy with meaning. The river has returned what was taken. But what is returned is not what was lost. It is a shadow, a reflection, a mirror of what once was. The child, still floating above the river's surface, began to move. Slowly, it turned its head, its gaze fixing on the villagers. And as it did, the air seemed to crackle with an unnatural energy, like the spark before a fire ignites. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping forward with deliberate, measured steps. It was the witch. The villagers recoiled, their fear rising to a crescendo, but the witch paid them no mind. She walked toward the child, her long, dark hair flowing behind her like the river itself. Her eyes, once cold and distant, were now filled with something more. A hunger, a desire, an insatiable thirst. She reached the child and placed a hand on its head, her fingers sinking into its skin as though it were made of water. The child's body rippled, its form shifting, becoming more fluid, more liquid. It was as though the child was becoming part of the river itself. "This is the end of the bargain," the witch whispered, her voice low and ominous. "The river has given back what it took, and now it claims what is owed." The child's form began to dissolve, its body turning into droplets of water, scattering into the air like mist. The villagers could only watch in silent horror as the child, once whole, now became part of the river, absorbed into the current. And then the witch turned to face them, her eyes glowing with an eerie light. "The cycle is complete," she said. "You have made your offering, and the river has taken its due. There is no more to give, no more to take. The river has claimed its heart, and with it, your town is no more." With that, the witch turned away, her form fading into the shadows. The river, now calm, returned to its usual state, its surface once again still as though nothing had ever happened. But the villagers knew. They knew that the river's hunger had not been satisfied. The cycle would continue. It always did. The town was gone, claimed by the river and its ancient hunger. And in the silence that followed, the villagers understood the truth. They were no longer free. They were part of the river now, bound to its depths, lost in its endless flow. The heart of the river had claimed them all. The days after the pact were heavy, weighed down by the hollow silence that filled the town. The villagers moved through their routines as if on autopilot, their faces hollowed out by the immense burden they had borne. Yet the river remained. It flowed relentlessly, just as it always had, its dark currents a constant reminder of the price they had paid. The cost they could never escape. There were no more children to laugh in the streets. The market, square, once bustling with energy, now stood empty, the stalls abandoned, their wares untouched. The houses, too, felt colder, their hearths unlit, their windows darkened. No one dared speak of the children they had lost, for fear that doing so would bring them closer to the truth that could not be undone. At night, the wind howled through the trees, its mournful cry like the voice of the river itself, echoing through the village. The whispers, faint at first, had returned. But they were not the whispers of the lost children. They were the whispers of something darker, something deeper than the village had ever known. And then there was the feeling that something was wrong. The villagers felt it in their bones, in the pit of their stomachs. The land itself seemed to have changed. The trees grew twisted and dark, their gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like reaching hands. The air had grown thick, as though something unseen hovered just beyond the edge of perception, waiting, watching. James Turner's house stood at the outskirts of the village, a small, somber dwelling that once held the warmth of family. Now, it was empty, save for the shadows that crept along the walls. The blacksmith's hammer was silent, the anvil cold. The hearth, which had once burned with the warmth of his children's laughter, was cold, the embers long since extinguished. But even in the silence, James's presence lingered, like an echo that refused to fade. His absence had left a hole in the very fabric of the town, one that could never be filled. The villagers, though they did not speak of it, knew that he had given everything in his desperation to save them. And in the end, it had not been enough. But the river had not forgotten. The witch had not forgotten. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the hills, casting long shadows over the village, a figure appeared at the edge of the water. The wind had calmed, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. The figure, cloaked in shadows, stood at the river's edge, its gaze fixed on the water. There was a sense of purpose in its movements, as though it was waiting for something, waiting for a sign. The villagers, who had long since learned to avoid the river, watched from a distance, their hearts heavy with foreboding. They knew what it was, knew it as surely as they knew their own names. The witch had returned. The figure remained still for what felt like an eternity. And then, as if in answer to an unspoken question, the water began to stir. A ripple spread out from the center of the river, growing wider, more powerful, until it reached the banks. The surface of the water began to churn, its calm surface breaking apart like glass, shattering under a heavy blow. The villagers held their breath as the figure stepped closer to the water. And then, it spoke. "Come forth." The voice was low and resonant, carrying across the water like the sound of an ancient bell tolling. The words seemed to hang in the air, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the backs of their necks rise. The witch's presence was unmistakable, her influence as palpable as the river itself. It was a call, an invitation, or perhaps a command. And without warning, the river responded. The water rose, not in a simple ripple, but in a violent surge. It surged upwards, twisting and writhing as if the river itself was alive, fighting against something beneath the surface. The figure, standing at the water's edge, raised a hand, and the river's movement stilled. The surface became calm once more, but the air was thick with something dark, something ancient. And then, from the depths, something rose. At first, it was indistinct, a shadow, a shape barely visible against the water's surface. But as it rose higher, it became clearer. It was not a creature, not a monster, but a person, a child, James Turner's child, his daughter. The villagers gasped in horror and disbelief as Clara's form emerged from the river, her body pale and lifeless. She floated above the water, her eyes wide open, her expression frozen in a look of pure terror. She was not whole, not as she had been. Her skin was cold and mottled, her body stiff and unnatural. She was no longer the innocent child they had once known, but something else. Something twisted. The witch's voice echoed through the stillness. You see now, don't you? The river has taken what it wanted, what you gave it. But in return, it gives back only a shadow, a reflection of what was lost. The villagers stepped back, horrified. They watched as Clara, her lifeless form suspended above the water, turned her head toward them. Her eyes, once full of life and light, were now empty, hollow, devoid of all warmth, of all innocence. The witch's gaze swept across the crowd, her eyes glinting with something dark, something cruel. You sought to bargain with the river. You sought to restore balance, to stop the suffering. But the river is not a thing of mercy. It is not a thing that can be reasoned with. It does not care for the lives of those who live by its banks. It only takes, and it only gives, what it chooses. She turned back to Clara, raising her hand once more, and the child's body began to dissolve into the water, her form fading like mist in the morning sun. The villagers watched in silent horror as the child was pulled back into the river, her body becoming one with the current. The last trace of their hope, their sacrifice, disappeared before their eyes. And then the witch spoke once more, her voice filled with cold satisfaction. You see, the river has its heart, and now you are all part of it. Your lives, your memories, your town, they are mine now. They are the river's, and there is no end to the flow. As she turned away, the villagers felt it, felt the weight of her words, the crushing truth. The river had taken them, and they had no choice but to follow. The witch, now fading into the mist, left the river as still and calm as it had ever been. But the villagers knew the truth now. They were bound to the river, bound to its endless cycle. They had made their choice, and they would live with it forever. And so, the river flowed on, its current ever moving, ever changing, yet always the same. It had claimed them, and now they were part of it. They would never escape. The heart of the river had been revealed, and with it, the last secret. There was no end. There was only the flow,